Thank you. On behalf of Artes de México in Utah, I'd like to welcome you all this evening. My name is Jorge, and I have the pleasure of serving on the board of directors for Artes de Mexico. This program is funded by the Utah Humanities Council. The Utah Humanities Council enriches our cultural, intellectual, and civic life by providing opportunities for all Utahns to explore life's most engaging questions and the wonders of the human experience. This program is also supported in part by the Utah Arts and Museums with funding from the state of Utah and the National Endowment of the Arts. We want to thank the public library as well as friends of the library for supporting the event already occurred at the Pride Center. At BYU, with the Marriott Library, the State Fair, and Fiesta Mexicana, and Mestizo Institute of Culture and Art. Thank you all for coming tonight, and we'll start with Joe Marotta.
The Casasola Archives was new to me very recently, 10 or 15 years ago, fairly new to most people outside of Mexico. Considering the volume and the significance and the time in which these photographs were taken, it seems impossible. This archive of almost 500,000 photographs taken over a 35-year period by almost 500 different photographers encompasses this very, very important time period in Mexico from 1900 through the 1930s. Though Casasola didn't take all of these photographs, he certainly organized them, took many of them along with his brother Miguel, and is responsible for this significant recording of this time in Mexican history. He starts out as a typographer, becomes a reporter, but by 1900 sees the significance of photography as a medium to convey information. By 1897, the half-tone process was used in newspaper reproduction, so lithographs, drawings no longer had to be used. And that kind of clarity and accuracy of depiction was something that people wanted. And this is happening all over the world. And I think Casasola has the kind of foresight to see that photography is the future. It will be, the way information, particularly in the reportage of events, that will be significant. The art photographer Laszlo Moholy-Nagy in 1931, Bauhaus teacher, said the illiterate of the future would be those who do not know how to use a camera. And perhaps Casasola saw this in 1900. He not only takes photographs, he organized the first photographic press agency in 1910, 1911. And that's really becomes the beginning of the archive. Casasola, in some kind of context of what other photographers were doing, was he influenced by these photographers? Today, of course, we have most photographers come out of educational systems which they know the history of art, they know the history of photography. At that time, of course, that just wasn't true. He did not have that advantage of higher education. He did not have the advantage of the upper class to make trips to Europe. And so I don't know how much he knew about what was going on in photography in other parts of the world. But we'll try to put that in some kind of a context. He considered himself a photojournalist. He did not consider himself an artist. And yet, when we look at some of his photographs, there's obviously a knowledge, a kind of applied aesthetic that's there. Now, where does that come from? All right, there's a quote by another Mexican photographer, Manuel Alvarez Bravo. Bravo starts photographing around 1930. He too is certainly embedded in the Mexican culture, but he's also influenced by European art, particularly surrealism. He's a good friend with French photographer Garcia. He knows Edgar Weston, another important photographer of the time. And he said, "My work is more related to Mexican art and Mexican life than to photographic traditions." I think we could take that statement and apply it to Casasola's work. That it is the time in which he lives and the culture that surrounds him, I think, that defines the direction that his photography takes. And I think there's another Chilean essayist, poet, Pablo Neruda, in his book Absence and Presence, who wrote, "There is no space wider than grief. There is no universe like that which bleeds." And I think that too might apply to the time of the Mexican Revolution and what Casasola witnessed and what perhaps he thought his photographs could record. So I'd just like to run through, I put together some images. Again, I'm used to putting together 50-minute lectures, so there were way too many, but I think I've edited it down. It would be probably more appropriate to do about 10 lectures on this archive because it covers so much. I think the only thing close to this might be the Farm Security Administration photographs in the U.S. in the 1930s, which was government-sponsored and included 11 photographers over 7.5 years and over 270,000 negatives. That's maybe close to this. I can't think of anything else in the history of photography. All right, this particular image is one of Casasola's photographs. Someone in the street, isolated, surrounded by an environment, contextualized, but we also have the evidence of the photographer. You know, the inclusion of the camera, the inclusion of the photographer, that shadow tells us, I am here. It locates not just the viewer in time and space, but says, this is important to me. You are looking at me taking the photograph. This idea of investigating the street, and this photograph is, this is taken 1913, I think. Yeah, 1911, 1913. There's another photographer who is photographing at exactly the same time in Europe with the same level of commitment and the same level of depth in his own culture. His name is Eugene Atget. Atget's photograph of this street vendor is very similar to Casasola's photograph. Atget would photograph the streets of Paris, and he would photograph often including his own reflection or his own shadow. So there is a similarity there. Is there any evidence that Atget was a photographer known to Casasola? Not that I am aware of. It would make sense. But outside of Paris, not very many people knew who Atget was. So an early Casasola print, around 1915, shows people just walking and parading around at the racetrack. I find this an interesting photograph, and also something that I find that runs through many of the Casasola archive is this kind of immediacy of the present, of time. And this type of photography was very difficult to do in 1911, 1910, 1915. Really difficult to do until the introduction of the Leica camera, 1924, 1925, 35 millimeter. Before that, there were 4x5, 5x7 cameras. The Speed Graphic, a 4x5 portable camera, was introduced in 1925. There was the Kodak camera of 1888, and that was used for many years and had a fairly fast shutter, a 30th of a second. So how did Casasola make this photograph? And many of his photographs that are on exhibit here show this kind of capturing of a moment. And from looking at the enormous amount of detail and the edges of the frame, the white or the black border, we can tell that it's a view camera. And in some cases, a 4x5 or a 5x7. So how did he do this stopping of gesture? In this respect, he's ahead of his time. It also, at the same time, as this photograph. A young photographer in Paris named Jacques-Henri Lartigue, who was an adolescent, started photographing when he was 7 years old. This photograph was taken, 1907, 1908, and it just depicts people walking on the street. He had to, like Casasola, intuit the moment in a sense before the moment happens, and click his shutter, not using a Leica, but using a kind of crude small camera, or medium format camera we call today. So these two photographers, and no one knew about what Lartigue was doing either. He became really unknown until the 1960s. Casasola was able to apply this idea of that split second of time and space that would never happen again. I think this is an astounding photograph. Probably taken with a 4x5 camera. This immense number of people crowded in this space on Independence Day. It seems to go on forever. The long lens compresses the space, and yet in that field of anonymity, we have one figure, the soldier in the center, but we also have a secondary figure, the child, right here. Right, so this relationship between this young child who appears to be looking towards the camera, and then this fellow right here, kind of links the kind of disparity of social roles as well as age, and makes that huge mass of people somehow more human. He also photographed just people walking in the street. And these are all photographs that are taken in the teens. So again, it precedes the fluidity and ease of the 35 millimeter, or this photograph. Now, of course, other photographers were working with trying to do this. One of the most important art photographers of the 20th century, and the one person that we give credit to promoting art or promoting photography as fine art, Alfred Stieglitz, used the 4x5 camera to try and capture that kind of life of the street. And in this photograph, we see the horse-drawn trolleys in winter, the steam rising off of their backs, something that the photographers had never thought of doing. Would there be enough light? How could you stop action? And Stieglitz found a way to do that. Did Casasola know about Stieglitz? It's very possible. Stieglitz started a publication called Camera Work, which existed until about 1916, 1917, and published many photographs, but also published modern art. And Casasola would more than likely have seen some of these issues of camera work. But I still would think of Stieglitz as an influence here, just that they're maybe driven by the own experiences of their time. The camera is used primarily in Europe, and Casasola is aware of this development. He knows about the developments in photography, and he starts to shoot the 35 millimeter Leica by the 1930s. But this idea of the moment, I think, is something that's a part of his very, very earliest photographs. So it makes sense. Also, I think this, if European cities in Mexico, like Mexico City, they're vibrant places. They're places where life occurs in the street. Cafe life is important. People are in the parks. There's a lot of dialogue. There's a lot of mixing of people's ideas. And I think the Leica camera is suitable for capturing that. The gesture, the stop motion, the brief changes in light. And so I think it makes sense that in Mexico City, where life also is happening in the streets are crowded, where cafe life is important, that he would choose to record that. And it would make sense that perhaps the 35 millimeter Leica, when it came about, would be a camera that he would use. But Cartier-Bresson's photograph, Henri Cartier-Bresson, photographer that we give the term decisive moment to, and it's just an amazing image to predict when that fellow's heel is going to hit that puddle of water and click the shutter just before it happens. Because if you wait for it to happen, it's gone. I mean, that kind of instant is something that we see over and over again in Casasola's photographs. André Cortez, another French photographer in the late 1920s, was aware of the possibilities of this camera and that immediacy of photography. Did he know Bresson and Cortez? He certainly knew Bresson, but that was years later. That would be probably, early to mid-1930s. A photographer named Versailles photographed the Café Life of Paris in the early 1930s. Versailles' specialty was the nightlife of Paris. And we see in some of Casasola's photographs, of cabarets, of bars, of places where people would go to dance. There's a photograph of people dancing in this exhibition. And again, I think it's that time period. It's life itself that instigates the approach through photography. I don't think it's one photographer necessarily influencing another. Versailles had a book published, Paris at Night, in 1932. Casasola starts photographing the nightlife of Mexico City well before then. Edgar Weston, who did this photograph, a very important American photographer, important because of the style in which he takes photography, its directness, its clarity, its dependence on detail and description. But in this case, his significance in his connection to Mexico itself. Weston went to Mexico a number of times between 1923 and 1926, spent a lot of time there, probably met Casasola. Next in travel with Tina Modate. Modate, an important American artist who learns photography from Weston. They have their separation because of their different political views, but she becomes an important photographer in Mexico, and certainly would have known Edgar, of course, in Mexican art. So I guess what I'm starting to think is that Casasola is influenced, as Bravo states, Mexican art. He's influenced by Mexican art and Mexican life, the life that's going on around him, and that immediacy of the visual image and the ability of photography to capture that, I think, comes out of that, not from any direct influence by another specific photographer. This is a photograph by Manuel Alvarez Bravo. Bravo is certainly one of the more important photographers of the 20th century. He photographed people in the street, but many of his photographs have that influence of surrealism, the kind of mixing of the kind of reality with this kind of fantasy or unreality. In this case, men sitting at a bar, but their heads are severed by the shadow. Bravo also did this photograph, purposely presenting it backwards. The idea of signage, mannequins, reflections. This is something that we see in many of Casasola's photographs. But people like Bravo kind of focus on this. Again, it's definitely linked to surrealism. These photographs are from the early 1930s. Casasola's, I think, portraits are very important, and these go right back to the early 1900s and continue. His photographs are sometimes contextualized, like the very first photograph, and sometimes take place in a neutral, more studio background. In every case, there's definitely a connection between the person photographed and the photographer. Some have written that he was maybe influenced by Nadar. Nadar is a photographer of the mid to late 19th century in Paris. Photography was a very difficult medium at the time, and Edgar did some extraordinary photographs. This is taken around 1913. I also think there might be a link to American photographer Louis Hine. Hine was a humanist and worked for the child labor committee to bring about change in the working conditions of children in the United States between around 1907 and 1912. And Hein photographed children, often contextualizing them in these places of work. And we see some work like this in Casasola's photographs. This is another Louis Hein photograph. And here we have one of his more famous photographs. And we see the directness, the full figure, the neutral background, some indication of the person's personality. And I think what we take away from this is that sort of clarity that photography can bring, and its detail and descriptive characteristics. And we certainly also see that in this portrait of am I looking at quickly? He's famous. Zapata, right? Zapata's photograph. These two people knew each other. He photographed Zapata extensively. Photographed his body after he was assassinated. And the expression that we see in his face, and particularly his eyes, is something that we sort of take for granted when we look at photographs. Oh, that's a really good photograph. But to try taking a photograph of someone and having it come out like this, and I think he was able to establish that rapport, that trust, that allowed the subject to give a little bit of that to the photographer. And this is a photograph by Nadar taken in the 1860s. And of course it proceeds him. Did he know Nadar's work? Certainly possible. One of my favorite series that I did was People at Work. I think these are wonderful photographs. People aware of being photographed, some of them seem to be working, some of them obviously posed, and we have that wonderful context of space. By this time, some of these are taken as early as 1915, some as late as 1925, 26. The object of their profession in the foreground and the workers in the background. And we have sharp focus from that object all the way into the distance when we have these two. I'm pointing at something that you can't see. These fellows back here, way back in the distance. This kind of aesthetic composition, it's something that only comes through paying attention and through working over and over and over again. What works, what doesn't work. Or this photograph of the newspaper workers. And the soldiers on the train. So these contextualized portraits, either exhibiting the elements of a profession, or some aspect of Mexican culture, I think are really extraordinary. The only photographer that I can think of that comes close to this would be Alexander, the German photographer of the 1920s and 1930s, who did an extensive study of German people and their professions. In this case, circus people, the bricklayer in this case. Very direct, and I think that's something that identifies Casasola's work. This is only one image that I show, and again, there's so many images and so many types of subject matter. This is one where he, and there are a few of these, where he restages a crime. And that's really fascinating to me. I mean, he did photograph much of the revolution, and that included executions, photo portraits of people before they were executed, the kind of horrible destruction of war. But this kind of reenactment enters the world of theater and directing and posing. And that's very, very different. And it's very different to photography. Certainly some of that was done in the 1850s with some photographers who fabricated kind of allegorical scenes. But in the 1920s, this was very unusual. The only thing I can think of is that it sort of points to this sort of directorial style of photography that is prevalent today. Many photographers today construct photographs to be photographed. They are directors, they are lighting designers, they hire actors. Everything is set the way a movie set would be, and then they take the photograph. So it alludes to a real event, but also maybe the mediated event. And this Casasola photograph reminds me of that. One last image, yes. Okay. This is by Guatemalan photographer. His name is Gonzalez Palma. He's a contemporary photographer. And I think his directness, he's a portrait photographer, but he also stages his photographs and alters his photographs and contextualizes them in an almost theatrical way. And I think maybe this goes back to Casasola's sort of directness in maybe some of these early photographs.
To give you just some perspective as to what we're looking at, this is Edgar, who invented the daguerreotype. And photography came to Mexico very early, came in 1839, and became instantly popular throughout the country. So I'm going to look at three different perspectives of photography tonight. One, kind of as a new profession, primarily in the 1800s. And then at the turn of the century, we get into more photojournalism, which is where we see Casasola show up. And then after the revolution, which I probably won't get to, probably for another day. But photography is art, and that's where we get individuals that are just flocking to Mexico, like Tina Modotti, like Edgar. We get Mexican photographers getting involved as well. The Bravos, Lola Alvarez Bravo, Manuel Alvarez Bravo, and other photographers that really took advantage of the cultural revolution that was occurring in Mexico after the revolution. This is an early daguerreotype of a Mexican woman, and when photography came to Mexico, I mentioned that it was exceptionally popular, primarily among the urban middle class, who really enjoyed and got into the idea of having their portraits taken. And their portraits taken primarily, basically to, they looked at a portrait as a way to immortalize their personal heroes or family members that had passed, or in some of the photographs I've looked at, to actually remember small children or babies who had died. And so there are a lot of photographs out there. So these really did become images of devotion that were placed, in prominent places in the home or on altars in the home or things like that. Monsiváis said this about the 1800s. Said it's a question of priorities and patronage. The 19th century middle class relied on pictures only to eternalize the majesty, presumed or real, of their exterior physical features. Photographs were important as expressions of sentiment to be exchanged or models for outward behavior, but were not and could not be considered art, since they lacked the power to transform the sitter's greatness and humanity into universally valid objects. So really, during the 1800s, during the 19th century, we really just see this as a profession. Studios started popping up all over Mexico. In fact, the first studio in Mexico was about 1853, 1854 by a Frenchman. And within 7 years, we have 20 portrait studios within Mexico City alone. So from about the decades 1860, the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, the primary use of photography was for portraits. One thing that helped further the idea of photography in Mexico was actually the Mexican War in the 1800s. During this time, photographers actually started going out and shooting pictures of the battlefields, shooting pictures of men in uniform, or men and their spouses or wives in their uniform as well. So this really became a way to kind of immortalize some of the heroes of the Mexican War, which actually kind of was a springboard. This idea of taking pictures of the war was a springboard into taking pictures for the revolution. By the turn of the century, you get a new profession, which is primarily photojournalism, which is where we see Casasola come in. Now, you have to understand, at the time of the revolution, so in the teens, we have a couple of other big wars that are going on at the same time. We have World War I, and we also have the revolution in Russia. World War I wasn't really photographed. After the battles occurred, photographers went in and they took pictures of the bodies, or they took pictures of the destruction in the fields, but it really wasn't photography about the war or the ideas or the values that were being portrayed. The reason the war was significant was the way that it changed warfare, but it wasn't significant in the way that photography was done. In Russia, we don't get any pictures of bloody battles at all. I mean, there were very few, but we don't get pictures. In fact, a lot of the pictures that we see from the revolution almost look like a laborer's march, where we see kind of like the idea of the urban soldier rather than actually battles. We also see pictures of Lenin and Trotsky as kind of these icons of power in the war. But as far as photography being this changing dynamic that actually had a great influence in the war, we don't see that in the Revolution or World War I. We do see it, however, in the Mexican Revolution. The photojournalist becomes the primary profession of the time. This quote right here, the bulk of the picture making was done either by news photographers in the line of duty or by individuals who were either participants or spectators and had a particular interest in what was going on. The newsmen were not artists, but simply photographers earning a living. Few of the others had any idea that their pictures would be reproduced. So really, it wasn't until the revolution that we start to see photos accompany news stories. And a lot of that had to do with Casasola, because he was one of the few that started to do that. He started using photographs to enhance the stories that he was telling in the news. And at some point or another, there was a shift that happened in that photography was almost essential to prove that these events had really occurred. So you really did need photography. Famous picture of Porfirio Diaz, who at the centenary celebrations in 1910 realized the power of photography. What better way to use photography to promote your ideal or your image, and particularly he chooses a really interesting landmark to take his picture by, kind of signifying the connection with the indigenous past and also him moving the country into the future. This is actually a very symbolic moment for Mexico. Casasola was the primary photographer of Porfirio Diaz until he was exiled in 1911. But Madero realized the power of photography early on and started having a photographer follow him around to take pictures and promote his image and trying to get support for his cause. He was often portrayed similar to this, as an English gentleman with a suit, a riding hat. Others, for example, Pancho Villa started out similarly dressed, but eventually changed to kind of that rogue, mysterious image that we see later on. And then we even see Huerta, who uses his military regalia and uniform to promote his image. And then Obregón, of course, his famous picture where he goes in, he's getting his arm amputated, takes a photographer in with him to the surgery room, and it's shown with his arm lifeless at his side, no doubt in great pain, but showing his kind of quiet, reserved composure, has his picture taken, and then later every photograph that was shown of him showed his arm, his sleeve, his empty sleeve, again kind of showing this idea of a trophy from the war. As we know, Casasola created the Agencia Fotográfica Mexicana that's responsible for some of the images that you see in the archive now. But I find it interesting that their slogan was, "I have or I'll take the photo you need." And then I wanted to end on this photograph because it is considered the photograph of the revolution, the entire revolution. We see, it's called Via en Vacía, shortened from Via en Vacía Presidencial, which is the presidency after Diaz was removed from power, and you see Zapata next to him. So you see this image of the revolutionary coming in and taking over and changing the fate of Mexico. And all of this was done through photography, through the power that these revolutionary leaders started to recognize early on because of Madero and Diaz and their use of photography.
Okay, so I just want to thank Artes de México in Utah and Susan and Jorge in particular for having me here. And I just want to clarify, I'm actually not a photographer. I am the artist and person who studies and practices the use of art for social change and community change, and I facilitated the project. This is a project of young people who worked with the photographer Eliza Q. Hemingway, who is now a filmmaker in the Bay Area. But it was a rigorous arts program that I had developed, and we brought in professional artists. And I had been in this community that I'm going to talk about for 7 years, which was what allowed me to work with the kids, and it was long after my car tires were slashed, and I had to roll down my window and shout out, "It's Beth from the Boys and Girls Club," so I wouldn't get shot at. It was a very cloistered community that was not in tumult in the mid-1990s, and it's Charlestown, Massachusetts, which is a 4 square mile community surrounded on 3 sides by water and on another side by the freeway, and so very geographically isolated, but also isolated for other reasons. And it made the national news twice. In the 1960s, when the Boston public schools were being desegregated, mothers would lie down in front of the buses to prevent the buses from leaving Charlestown, and at the time it was predominantly Irish American Catholic, and when the buses would come in from the neighboring community of Rock Spring, Massachusetts, where the children were mostly African American, members of the Charlestown community were throwing rocks and other things into the buses. The second time it made the national news was in the 1990s, which is the time that I was there. And it made the news because it was something called the Code of Silence. So it's the largest unsolved murder rate in the United States. So for those of us who worked there and were familiar with the community, we all knew who the murderers were, and I was working with many of their children and had to sometimes lock the kids in the office until the parents would calm down, and then we let them go, and we marched in parades with the FBI holding guns facing, aimed at us, because there was retaliation across generations and happened in prison, and pretty much every weekend someone was killed in this community. And one weekend, these are some of the 57 6 to 14-year-old kids who were engaged in this. One weekend a child was killed, and I was directing the art and education program at this Boys and Girls Club, and I called the health center. I said, "Please, you have to send someone down here. They've just lost one of their peers, and the health center was overbooked." So not only am I not a photographer, I'm not a psychologist, but I did sit down with the kids, and I heard their stories. And I spent 20 years in the Boston area, but I grew up in Utah. So I'll be honest, I was sort of sheltered during that period. So I was sitting with about 20 kids, and one after the other said stuff like, "My father was murdered in jail. I saw someone shot on the street, and I saw someone come and grab their wallet out of their pocket. I heard someone being killed in the apartment above me, and I hid under the bed. I was walking by the dumpster, and I saw someone being killed." So I literally listened to these stories, and my first instinct was I just wanted to protect these children. Within a nanosecond, I knew I couldn't, no one can. But what I realized is I could help them celebrate life, and how I knew to do that was through art, somewhat religiously, started to call themselves the Piece of Piecers, and really bonded. This is Matt Ezekiel, by the way. And no topics, we explored any topic they wanted. And by the way, there was a lot of rigorous looking at images, and it's a book of poetry and a lot of rigorous writing and reading of stuff because it took about 6 months before there was anything worth saving, to be honest. But we talked about what does occupation mean, and the kids hadn't been able to talk about that in school. It was something they were definitely talking about at home. And this was a sibling as brother documenting his sister. The sister documented the brother. This piece was taken by 7-year-old Caitlin Rodriguez, and she called it Peace for Franz. And I asked her, well, why did you title this Peace for Franz? And she said, well, when Franz gets on the bus every morning, the children spit on him. So one of the things that was fascinating to me was to see how these kids started looking out for each other, which wasn't necessarily happening before. This is Caitlin Rodriguez. And they really formed a strong bond. This is Pat Gould, who was a pretty brilliant artist, who was living on the streets for a while. You know, it's interesting. I hear from these kids, like out of the blue, after 10 years. I just got an email and a call from 2 of them a couple weeks ago. She went on full scholarship to college at the Roosevelt Boyle. Anyhow, sorry, I don't want to talk about Wendy Wall. But what I do want to talk about very briefly is what happened to this community when these young people completed this project. So first of all, I already mentioned that people were living, 70% of them were living out of below the poverty level. And mothers, it was mostly the women, but mothers and aunts of the children would come and literally empty their pockets of change and put $20 down for me. And I'd say, well, what is that? And they said, well, I went through the project and I collected money for the Piece of Piecers. And I literally had to turn around with tears flying out of my eyes because I knew people I could probably call and say, look, we just need $10,000. The truth is I did call those people to help send some of these kids to college, and luckily they did do that. But there was such incredible ownership of this project that the kids initiated. So I was just the facilitator, and Eliza Hemingway was just the facilitator in a way. I mean, we did have to teach them skills so that they could actually create what they had intended. But they did this all. And at the end of the project, the book, which was, I think, well, $18, sold out over and over and over again in this community. And that was quite a bit of money, $18 in the mid-90s. And the kids wanted to sell it. The most important place in their community was Demula's Market Basket. It was the grocery store. So that's where we had a lot of our exhibitions, and the book was selling out. But the code of silence that I mentioned, that no one would sort of tell who killed each other, was actually broken for the first time in 20 years. So the mothers of these children, with the Catholic clergy, started talking. And the kids obviously weren't involved in that. We had to change a lot of things about their poetry and other things so that they could never be targeted for hearing or seeing something. But these young people started this change that, not completely, but it had a huge impact on the community that lasted for many years. And there's still some rippling of that. So I think my 10 minutes is up. But I do think it's a really interesting example of this idea of art and social change, and Howard Zinn and others endorsed the book for that reason, and it got a lot of national and international coverage from the Jesuit community and the Quaker community because of this idea of peace and change. And I'm just going to end with a quote that really, I think, drove the framing of this project. And it's by Paulo Freire, who was Brazilian, and he actually grew up very, very poor, and it was that impetus that caused him to use his life through education, but it's actually impacted a lot of community-based art, to change things for young people. But he said that knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, with the world, and with each other. And it was that type of sort of hopeful inquiry that these young people engaged in that made a difference, both for themselves, I would argue, and their communities. So, thanks.
My job is to give you a primer on the Mexican Revolution, so that the discussions of the art have a larger context for you. And in order to understand the Mexican Revolution, as I think there are a couple of things about the 19th century in Mexico that are important to understand in order to understand why a man named Porfirio Diaz came to power in Mexico in 1876 and ruled Mexico from 1876 to 1911. That presidency and then dictatorship was the political regime against which revolutionaries fought. So the Porfiriato is very important in terms of understanding why the Mexican Revolution occurred and why it looked the way it